A light entered his living room like a secret that had finally decided to speak. It was not a trick of the brain, and it was not a dream. It was a presence that spoke without lips and touched without hands. And it told him a sentence that fractured everything he thought he knew about Egypt and human origin. What I am about to show you will change the way you look at pyramids, temples, and the idea of who shaped our memory. If you want to trace the line between ancient design and a technology that feels like magic, stay with me. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the field documents and guided practices that accompany this investigation. The full guide with maps, audio samples at 432 Hz, and the protocol for safe frequency work is linked in the first pinned comment, and it contains the exact exercises that helped him integrate what he saw. Now listen to how it began for Dr. Nathaniel Riyadh and why his life ended up as a map for what I will reveal next. Before Nathaniel became the kind of scholar who people whispered about, he had been a boy who smelled river mud and listened to the hollow sound of stone. Born in Alexandria to a mother who taught him to read ancient inscriptions with her finger and a father who repaired water pumps at dawn, he learned early that some things are repaired by touch and some things are remembered by listening. As a teen, he read every available translation of Sumerian tablets and Egyptian stelae, and at 22, he earned a fellowship in comparative archaeoacoustics that took him from dusty basements of museums to the banks of the Nile. He published papers that were careful at first, but curiosity pushed him into public claims, and the Academy pushed back with cold citations and polite dismissals. A colleague at a major museum accused him of romanticizing data, and a journal rejected his experiments as anecdotal. He lost grants, invitations, and the trust of a mentor named Professor Elias Moreau, who once told him that science is patience, not poetry. But loss became a conduit. After the funeral of his younger sister Layla, who drowned in a river current that the family did not fully understand, he began to look for systems that could align water and stone and breath. The search grew from questions into ritual. He learned breathing methods from Farida Kamel in Cairo and tone exercises from Samuel Ortiz, who recorded birdsong and then filtered it through 432 Hz tuning. He learned to measure micro-vibrations with instruments borrowed from Dr. Miriam Albright and to interview elders like Ahmed Saleh, who still remembered songs used to bless boats. Nathaniel carried grief like a compass and method as his map. He was not a zealot. He was a man who had been reduced to curiosity by loss and who kept notes that smelled of old paper and river salt. That backstory made his claims credible to some and reckless to others, and it set the scene for the night a light entered his flat. The night began ordinary. Rain hit the window in small, polite taps. The room smelled of tea and the faint oil of the old lamp that he always kept for late work. He was alone, running a frequency sweep across a scale centered at 432 Hz when the air in the room thickened with the taste of copper. The lamp flickered, and the computer screen showed a waveform he had never seen before, a low harmonic that seemed to fold into itself like a ripple folding into a river bend. The light appeared near the corner of the room, as if it had been stored there by the stone of the building itself. It was blue and warm, and it hummed in a way that felt like a memory rather than a sound. He tried to speak and found that words arrived with weight, as if they had to travel through water. The presence spoke directly into his mind with a voice that was older than language and older than fear. Voice: "Do you remember the first capstone, Nathaniel? Who are you?" Voice: "We are the trace that remained when builders left, Nathaniel." Builders of what? Voice: "Pyramid and machine and seal and river, Nathaniel." You mean gods? Voice: "Names are cladding over function, Nathaniel." Why me? Voice: "Because you listen with breath and have lost, so you look for shape, Nathaniel." Prove it. Voice: "Watch and feel and let your pineal open to tuning." I am a scientist. I need proof. Voice: "Proof is in resonance, not in paper. The cells remember the pulse, Nathaniel." How can cells know? Voice: memory, cellular recall is how the seal wakes, Nathaniel. If this is a trick, I will not follow. Voice: if this is a trick, you will not return the same either way. There were 12 exchanges in that first conversation, and each phrase landed with a texture. He felt a salt coldness behind his nose, the way one feels before stepping into an ocean he has never swum. The hair on his forearms rose as if each strand was a tiny antenna. His teeth slightly vibrated with the low note, and his chest filled with a pressure like descending into breath training. He smelled dust and river mud as if both were in the room, and tasted a sweetness like dates. The presence did something to time. Seconds expanded and contracted, and his skin registered a warmth like a palm pressed to the sternum. The sensation of weightlessness came with the hum, and his inner ear acknowledged a turning that was not physical. He consented to watch. The proposal was simple and impossible. The presence offered a vision of the pyramid, not as tomb, but as machine. It said there were 3 layers to how the site: the external geometry, the internal sequence, and the human vessel that completed the circuit. The entity promised to show him the construction as it was experienced in the moment of activation, to reveal functions that modern archaeology had misread. It promised initiation and return, and it warned that some memories were stored as resonance and would affect the body. He felt a touch at the base of his skull, like a small magnet, and then the room folded into a corridor of light. The shift was not cinematic in the way films show teleportation. It was a migration of attention and sensorium. He saw the capstone again and again and again, as if rotated through possibilities. Sometimes it glowed with a golden cladding. Sometimes it was matte black with inscriptions that breathed. The entity explained the capstone was not merely decorative. It acted as a regulator of frequency, drawing quantum-like fluctuations through a narrow band that matched water flow and blood oscillation. Scene after scene unfolded like a lecture and a dream stitched together. I will describe now what he was shown with the specific sensory textures he later wrote down and recorded in analog notes. In the workers' camp, there was the smell of fresh-cut cedar, the sound of stones chipping like soft thunder, the taste of sour milk and honey offered to workers, the heat of the midday sun on the nape of the neck, the grit of sand under bare feet, and an internal vibration that told of shared breath. In the temple interior, there was a metallic undertone like a struck gut string, the scent of frankincense and wet limestone, the sensation of cool damp air that moved along channels, the shimmer of carved reliefs catching light like scales, and a low pressure that hugged the ribs as if a slow drum was playing under the floor. Each scene carried 6 to 7 sensory notes, and each reinforced the claim that the structures were systems of activation, not mausoleums. The being taught him a language of function, not names. It described how the pyramid was built on a bedrock channel, where water was guided into a sequence of basins and pipes that matched the wavelength of human pulse. The capstone acted as a valve, and the cladding on the outer face worked as a refractive filter to collect cosmic alignment pulses during specific star alignments. In operation, the pyramid created a field that coaxed pineal chemistry into a configuration that modern science would label as altered, but the initiates of that era called opening. The entity used terms that Nathaniel had read in esoteric manuscripts and ancient lists, but rearranged them into operational directives. The words Anunnaki appeared in a register that was not worshipful, but procedural, as if those names had been one of many teams who applied techniques of resonance. The narrative suggested cooperation between terrestrial engineering and an intelligence that used geometry to translate between cosmic frequencies and cellular life. When he was shown the initiation sequence, it was cinematic and procedural. A participant would enter the inner corridor after undergoing breathing protocols and tonal tuning at 432 Hz. The sequence required 3 cycles of breath, a slow inhalation, a hold, and a long, controlled exhalation, while a set of stones emitted harmonics tuned to match heart rate variability. The capstone would then be aligned with the star sleeve, and water brought into the inner basin would begin to move in a way that synchronized with the sound. The person would lie in a sarcophagus-like device that was not designed for burial but for transduction. The body would be passive while the system modulated the pineal and the cellular registers of memory through tiny electromagnetic pulses and harmonic water flows. The experience was described as a retuning and a recall. Rituals acted as precise protocols. The being explained the concept of seal as a combination of encoded geometry and frequency patterns that kept memory dormant until activated by the right alignment and the right breath. There followed a long exploration of construction techniques with an emphasis on process. Workers used sledges lubricated by a mixture that reduced friction and created a microflow of sound under the stones. Foundations were laid using water carving and calendrical alignment tools that combined astronomy with acoustic markers. What he recorded as a technical excerpt was later condensed into precise words that I will paraphrase here using technical clarity. The protocol involved phased frequency sweeps starting at 16 Hz, moving through harmonic intervals up to 432 Hz, while monitoring microvolt differentials across a lattice using a copper coil array and a tuning fork scaffold. The system required synchronized breathing practices in human participants to stabilize heart rate variability and a water column calibrated to produce standing waves that match the intended harmonic. This description is a concise version of the method the presence demonstrated, and it reads like both ritual and engineering at the same time. The visions included a council of initiates who managed these activations. They had names and roles, and Nathaniel later recorded 8 secondary figures who appeared with specific behaviors. Dr. Miriam Albright was shown as an oracle of measurements who annotated stone with acoustic graphs. Karine Hassan was a quarry foreman who hummed patterns that coordinated the lift teams. Professor Elias Moreau appeared oddly in a vision as a skeptical scribe who later became fascinated and recorded the sequences. Layla Nassar was a waterkeeper who tuned the basins and taught breath. Ahmed Saleh was a boat captain who ferried initiates to the site and kept songs for alignment. Captain Jonah Ruiz appeared as a guard who corrected orientation marks and kept the star charts. Farida Kamel was an initiator who led breath sessions, and Samuel Ortiz was an outsider who brought foreign tuning systems that were integrated into local methods. Each character had a clear action and reaction, and each brought a human angle that Nathaniel used when he later tried to replicate parts of the sequences with local communities. The next layer of the vision mapped the pyramid into a system of temples and a river infrastructure that together formed an integrated network. Each temple had a clinical function and a symbolic name. One temple acted as a primer to adjust frequency and prepare the body. Another served as a hearth for memory extraction. A third focused on communal synchrony and created a field for shared experiential bonding. The river was not merely a transport route, but a channel of resonance, where water carried modulated frequencies between sites. Boats were tuned like strings, and the song of the boatman was a necessary part of the transport process. The narrative showed how pilgrims arrived by water carrying their breath the way a current carries leaves. The energy of these channels collectively retuned communities and created a map of healing and initiation across the landscape that modern maps had misread as ritual pathways. During the visions, Nathaniel experienced several moments of acute tension that are essential to understand because they show the cost of activation. One scene was set inside the inner chamber when the capstone alignment slipped. The room filled with a grinding low noise like 1,000 teeth. People began to cough blood, at first subtly, then more alarmingly as the field modulated too quickly. He felt a physical nausea and a pressure that made his ears pop and his vision shimmer. He later described how the initiates muffled their voices and sang a stabilizing tone to bring the system back into balance. That passage of danger lasted long enough for him to consider the ethics of bringing such knowledge into a modern world that lacked the cultural scaffolding to hold it. A second tense scene occurred when he attempted to replicate a small part of the sequence in a controlled setting with sensors. The instruments showed unexpected phase shifts that created micro arcs that burned a wooden test frame. He felt fear and a deep responsibility at that moment, and he stopped the experiment. The third tense moment involved a confrontation with a group of academics who accused him of fraud. The meeting became heated with raised voices and threatened litigation, and he experienced physical trembling that matched the tremor of the stones from his visions. Each tension scene is recorded with the inner process and outward consequences, so you can see how knowledge that changes memory carries real risk. Dialogues in the exploration sequences expanded the encounter into debates on ethics and meaning. In one reconstructed conversation between Nathaniel and Dr. Miriam Albright, there are 8 exchanges where data and feeling clash. Nathaniel: I believe the stones were instruments, not monuments. Miriam: measurements can be instruments of many things. Miriam: what exactly do you measure? Nathaniel: frequency coupling between stone and water. Miriam: how do you rule out improvisation? Nathaniel: the recordings show repeatable harmonics. Miriam: how were the samples? We used copper coil arrays and timing gates. Miriam: who judged the initiation procedures? Nathaniel: the initiates and community elders. Miriam: and what of harm? Nathaniel: harm was possible and mitigation was central. You are asking for a cultural responsibility? Yes, and that responsibility was handled within a communal governance that we lack now. In another set of exchanges with Kareem Hassan, the foreman hums sequences while Nathaniel tries to match pitch, and the interaction becomes a practical tutorial of call and response that shows 12 short swaps that emulate the original practice. After the visions, Nathaniel returned to his flat, and life did not go back to normal. The world felt like a page that had been annotated by a different hand. The first days, he found himself waking with the smell of wet stone and the taste of dates. His breath regulation improved, and he began to dream in tones. He performed small experiments to test parts of the system. He set up a coil array in an empty courtyard and invited a small group of trusted friends, including Farida Kamel and Ahmed Saleh, to practice breathing and to sing at 432 Hz. Within weeks, a volunteer reported a cessation of a chronic headache. Another person described a visceral memory of being in a river and later validated that memory with an elder who recognized the tune. These were preliminary and anecdotal outcomes, and he documented them with detailed field notes, digital recordings, and informed consent forms. The experience transformed his mission. He moved from scholarship to a kind of stewardship. He organized a small community of practitioners who called themselves initiates and who committed to practices that combined breath, tone, and service. The community included the 8 named supporters who contributed time, money, and local knowledge, and who later helped him when the backlash intensified. 6 months after the first event, Nathaniel was contacted by a journalist who ran a piece that framed his claims as lunacy. The article triggered threats and an investigation by an academic board. More dangerously, a private collector with an interest in rare artifacts offered funding, but his terms would have commercialized the rituals. There was a moral crossroad that is central to the story. Nathaniel refused the collector and sought instead to protect the sites and the knowledge by forming an alliance with local communities and by publishing methods for safe practice. He released audio clips at 432 Hz and provided guidelines on frequency limits and breathing durations. He emphasized harm reduction. He described the systems as technology that required cultural scaffolding, not as toys. His refusal to commercialize made enemies and allies. Captain Jonah Ruiz provided protection at one point when there were threats of artifact theft. Dr. Miriam Albright helped establish a peer review of the instrument readings, while Professor Elias Moreau returned as a skeptical collaborator who insisted on replicable metrics. There are technical descriptions worth isolating because they make the claim testable. The Putty Listor, Instrument protocol involved a copper coil lattice with nodal spacing calibrated at 1-meter intervals connected to a set of tuning forks, each tuned to specific harmonic ratios. The system required a water column whose depth created standing wave nodes at frequencies correlating with heart rate variability and required synchronized breathing sequences from participants that stabilized phase locks. The measurement protocol used microvolt amplifiers and spectral analysis software to capture the harmonic peaks and verify resonance stability. This is a condensed technical description of the approach that is intended to be reproducible without ritualese. 1 month after the initial vision, Nathaniel published a preliminary report and his community began using gentle practices around protected sites. They focused on breathwork meditation and communal song and avoided any attempt at full-scale activation. The community grew slowly and included educators and healers who worked with trauma survivors. The immediate outcome was not dramatic but noticeable. People reported calmer sleep, improved mood, and a sense of belonging. A small teacher training program emerged and Farida Kamel led the sessions. 3 months in, a local healer documented a case that drew attention. A woman who had suffered from an unresolved grief for decades reported a sudden lifting sensation after a series of guided sessions. She described memories recovering as if a cover had been peeled from them. The report was cautious but promising, and it attracted more observers. The community expanded its safeguards and formalized consent. Layla Nassar and Ahmed Saleh became public presenters who explained the songs and routes and emphasized that the system was a communal practice, not a private cure. 6 months later, the story had moved beyond rumor and academic reprimand into legal complications and the need for protection. The collector tried to buy influence and, when denied, attempted to remove artifacts. Captain Jonah Ruiz and Kareem Hassan organized local resistance, and the artifacts were secured in a community archive managed by a cooperative that included Samuel Ortiz and Dr. Miriam Albright. Nathaniel organized a small symposium with invited peers and community elders, and the event became a turning point. The symposium published a charter for ethical practice that included transparent data sharing, community governance, and harm mitigation protocols. The 6-month outcome also saw the beginning of responsible pilgrimage routes guided by elders who taught songs and breathing as part of cultural education. The transformation was not utopian. It was messy and political, and it required constant negotiation, but it demonstrated that knowledge of activation could be integrated with care when guided by collective responsibility. Throughout this narrative, there are 3 core tensions that must be acknowledged. The first is between knowledge and control. Technologies of activation can be used to heal or to manipulate, and the story shows how easy it is for outside money to commodify practices. The second tension is between reproducible data and subjective experience. Nathaniel needed both the instruments and the testimonies, and he learned to protect one with the other. The third tension is between memory as private and memory as communal. The system worked only when it was embedded in social practice. Each tension demanded procedural rules, which were later written into the charter and shared with the community. If you feel a pull in your chest as you listen to this story, please know you are not alone. Many people who watch these investigations report a visceral response to places that have long histories. Share below if you have ever felt like you had been somewhere before, even if you never saw it in person. Reply simply with yes or no, and if you want, add one word that names the feeling. Your comment helps build a map of resonance and guides which sites we explore next. We collect these responses respectfully, and they have informed our fieldwork. The community that forms here is part of the investigation. Your voice matters, and it helps others know they are not alone in remembering. The final weeks of this chapter were a mix of quiet ritual and public argument. Nathaniel learned to speak in 2 languages, the language of instruments and the language of story. He continued to work with Dr. Miriam Albright on measurements, and together they refined the coil array and the spectral analysis. Kareem Hassan taught them boat songs, and Layla Nassar systematized the water tuning. Professor Elias Morrow published a cautious paper with mixed conclusions, and that very caution opened more funding for careful replication studies. The initiates set clear limits on exposure and created a training academy that taught technique, empathy, and community governance. There is a line here between possibility and arrogance. Nathaniel often wrote in his journals that the work required humility and a refusal to monetize the mystery. He closed many entries with a practical note reminding himself that the pineal modulation and the cellular memory recall must be treated like a clinical intervention with informed consent. He also wrote about awe, the way people talk about sunrise and burial alike. He saw ancient teams working like engineers who spoke in prayers and technicians who kept breath like a ledger. The word Anunnaki appeared not as a divine master, but as one label among many for entities or groups that contributed knowledge exchange. The story reframes myth as protocol and rituals as engineering disguised in metaphors. In closing this narrative, remember that the discovery we are describing challenges assumptions rather than proving dogma. What Nathaniel found does not demand belief, it demands careful study and community responsibility. If this story touched something in you, subscribe and join the mailing list linked in the pinned comment to get the guide that contains maps, audio samples at 432 Hz, and the safety protocols. If you want to learn the breathing sequences, the guide walks you through them step by step with durations and frequency caps and explains how to create a safe practice in community settings. We will continue to publish updates, interviews with Dr. Miriam Albright, Kareem Hassan, and Professor Elias Moreau, and documents from the field that show how this knowledge is being stewarded. You did not come here by accident. Whether you felt a memory rise like a tide when you heard the words pyramid or pineal, or whether you came looking for controversy, you are part of the unfolding. The story of Egypt and its alien connection is less about extraterrestrial puppetry and more about the possibility that intelligence used geometry and frequency to store and recall memory in ways that modern eyes have forgotten how to read. If we approach these systems with humility, care, and communal governance, we might restore practices that heal without exploiting. If we ignore the ethical questions, we will repeat the same mistakes that turned sacred protocols into curiosities. The light that visited Nathaniel still waits in the old chambers, and in the river channels it waits like a question. The choice is ours to answer responsibly. If you want to go deeper, the guide and links are in the first pinned comment, and the community is in the description. Remember the final line he wrote in his journal after the symposium. You are not here by accident. You are here to remember.